Hello, I'm David Stephen Cohen. This talk was originally presented in 2005 as part of the New Jersey History Partnership Project. It is titled Commodore Robert F. Stockton and Monopoly Politics. In a Georgian mansion named Morven in downtown Princeton hangs a floor-to-ceiling portrait of a 19th century naval officer in formal military dress. He holds a sword across his body in his left hand, and his right hand rests on a cannon. This is Commodore Robert Field Stockton, aka Fighting Bob. Stockton is not as famous, at least in New Jersey, as his grandfather, Richard Stockton, who was the only signer of the Declaration of Independence to recant after he was captured and imprisoned by the British, and after whom a rest stop on the New Jersey Turnpike and a state college in southern New Jersey are named. Robert F. Stockton is better known outside New Jersey. The town of Stockton, California is named after him. Yet, like his portrait, Commodore Robert F. Stockton was a towering figure in 19th century New Jersey and the United States, for better or for worse. Robert Stockton's father, Richard Stockton Jr., was a Federalist lawyer who served in the U.S. Senate during George Washington's administration, and later in the House of Representatives during the War of 1812. Robert grew up in Princeton and attended what was then called the College of New Jersey, Princeton University today. Inspired by the British Admiral Horatio Lord Nelson, Stockton joined the United States Navy as a midshipman in 1811 and served as an aide to Commodore John Rogers. He saw action against the British during the War of 1812. After the British captured Washington, D.C., Stockton participated in the defense of Baltimore and Alexandria, Virginia. He was promoted to the rank of lieutenant in 1814. After the War of 1812, Stockton served under Commodore Stephen Decatur in the war against the Barbary pirates in North Africa, who were raiding American merchant ships and selling captured seamen American seamen into slavery. In 1821, Stockton took command of a newly commissioned schooner named the Alligator, and he was ordered by President James Monroe to accompany Dr. Eli Ayers, an agent of the American Colonization Society, to the west coast of Africa. The American Colonization Society, or ACS, was formed in 1816 by a New Jersey Presbyterian minister named Robert Finley from Basking Ridge. Henry Clay of Kentucky, later leader of the Whig Party, Andrew Jackson of Tennessee, later President of the United States, Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, and Francis Scott Key, the author of the Star-Spangled Banner, were all members of the ACS. From 1836 to 1849, James Madison, former President of the United States, served as the President of the ACS. Based on the premise that a biracial society was not feasible in America, the American Colonization Society sought to resettle free African Americans in Africa. There would be a twofold benefit. First, the quote-unquote heathen Africans would be converted to Christianity by African American Christians. And secondly, African Americans would bring Western civilization, quote unquote, to the quote uncivilized, unquote, Africans. Thus, the American Colonization Society reflected 19th century racial superiority behind the concept of the white man's burden and colonialism. In 1820, the American Colonization Society sent a group of colonists to Sherbro Island in Sierra Leone, but this effort was not successful. Stockton's mission was to find a more suitable location. He cruised along the west coast of Africa and concluded that Cape Mesurado was a more appropriate location for this colony. At gunpoint, by some accounts, Stockton convinced the local tribal leader, known to Westerners as King Peter, to cede land to the ACS, which later became the country of Liberia. One of the ironies of the situation was that King Peter initially was opposed to the cessation of the territory because he thought it would disrupt the slave trade in which he was complicit. One of the goals of the American Colonization Society was the suppression of the slave trade. In 1824, Stockton helped organize the New Jersey Colonization Society, of which he became its first president. The capital of Liberia was named Monrovia in honor of President James Monroe. Lieutenant Stockton also campaigned against flogging in the United States Navy, a practice widespread in both the British and the American navies in the 19th century, immortalized by Herman Melville in his last short story, Billy Budd. As captain of the Alligator, Stockton, quote-unquote, buried the cat. That was the cat o' nine tails, or the multi-tailed whip used in flogging. And later, as U.S. Senator, Stockton delivered a speech against flogging on the floor of the Senate in 1852. In 1828, Stockton returned to Princeton and got involved both in state politics and business. As early as 1796, a New Jerseyan, James Ewing, noted that there were only three methods to finance internal improvements. He was thinking about turnpikes, but it applied also to canals as well. The first, quote, by government undertaking the task at public expense, unquote. Second, quote, by men of large fortune and property undertaking works of public utility with a view to increase their fortunes and advance the value of their property, unquote. And third, quote, by men of large fortune and property undertaking works of public utility with a view to increase their fortunes and advance the value of their property, unquote. His conclusion was, quote, the last method, then, is the only one from which we hope for important public improvements, unquote. The financing of roads and canals was part of the debate of what was called internal improvements, namely the building of a national transportation infrastructure. The issue arose in 1806 when Thomas Edison proposed that the federal government finance the national road from Cumberland, Maryland to Wheeling, West Virginia, today U.S. Highway 40. In the 1820s, as part of the American system, Henry Clay wanted the federal government to finance roads and canals, recharter the Second Bank of the United States, and institute a protective tariff. These free issues defined the difference between the Whigs and the Democrats in the second political party system. However, as we shall see, these national issues take on a different hue when seen under the light of state politics. From the early 19th century, there had been talk about constructing a canal to link the Delaware River to the Raritan River. One major question was whether it should be financed by the federal government, as suggested by Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of Treasury, Albert Gallatin, in his 1808 report on internal improvements, or by the state following the model of the Erie Canal, completed in 1825, with private and public funds raised by the New York's Republican Governor DeWitt Clinton, or totally private funds, as was done with financing the Morris Canal and banking, chartered in 1812 24 to build a canal in northern New Jersey linking the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania with Newark Bay. To complicate matters, the Stevens family of Hoboken was considering building a railroad across central New Jersey linking Camden and South Amboy. In 1829, both the supporters of the canal and the railroad filed petitions for state charters. According to historian Wheaton Lane, Robert F. Stockton came across John Stevens's sons, Robert and John Cox Stevens, in the foyer of the Park Theater in New York City and came up with a compromise. Instead of choosing between the railroad and the canal project, the legislature would charter both on the same day, February 4th, 1830. However, Stockton offered a different interpretation of how to charter that came into existence in a speech he delivered in 1849. He said that he was not even in the state in 1830 and had nothing to do with the framing of their charters. Quote, returning to the state sometime after the charters were passed, I learned that the stock of the railroad company had been subscribed, that of 15,000 shares of the canal stock, only 1,134 shares had been taken. The books had been closed, the hope of digging a canal abandoned. There was no difficulty about the railroad. That was considered a safe enterprise with the protection already stipulated for in the charter. My private fortune was at this time safely invested, yielding me an ample income. I was absorbed in my profession and desired no business. I was importuned but for aid. I was assured that if the canal failed now, it was forever lost. And deeming the canal of infinite importance to the state and the nation, I subscribed the balance of the stock necessary to preserve the charter, amounting to over $400,000, unquote. Stockton then became the president of the new Delaware and Raritan Canal Company, but he soon realized that the canal couldn't compete with the railroad. So he petitioned the state legislature to allow him to construct a railroad along the banks of the canal from Trenton to New Brunswick, but this project was rejected by the legislature. In a brilliant move, Stockton then proposed that the Camden and Amboy Railroad and the Delaware and Raritan Canal be merged into the so-called joint companies. The New Jersey legislature agreed to this act of union on February 15, 1831. The act also granted 1,000 shares of stock in the joint companies to go to the state of New Jersey in exchange for a clause that no other railroad could compete with the Camden and Amboy between New York and Philadelphia. Quote, that it shall not be lawful at any time during the said railroad charter to construct any other railroad or railroads in this state without the consent of the said companies, which shall be intended or used for the transportation of passengers and merchandise between the cities of New York and Philadelphia, or to compete in business with the railroad authorized by the act to which this supplement is relative, unquote. The Act of Union also provided that the Camden and Amboy Railroad must pay the state a so-called transit duty of 10 cents a passenger and 15 cents a ton on freight. The railroad interpreted this to mean that the duties were to be paid only by those passengers and merchandise traveling across New Jersey from other states rather than within the state. There was criticism of this state-granted transportation monopoly from its inception. The Princeton Courier wrote the following satire of the Act of Union, quote, married today in Trenton on the 15th instance by the Honorable Legislature of New Jersey, Mr. Magnus Fluvius Canal, to Miss Angelus Ale Railroad, The peerless pair their jealousies forego, unite their stocks, and thus their wisdom show, embrace the state with their circling arms, and teach the world the magic of their charms, unquote. Robert F. Stockton defended the monopoly grant in a speech he delivered on September 24, 1849. In a mocking tone, he noted that at the recent, quote, anti-monopoly convention, unquote, speakers said that they wanted to be, quote, free from the tyranny of the railroad kings, ferry kings, and turnpike kings, unquote. Stockton's answer was that, quote, for myself, I never could perceive how the possession of a certain certificate of railroad or ferry stock made a man a king, unquote. He accused those advocates of, quote, free farms, free houses, free corn cribs, and free pockets, quote, of being socialists. He concluded with the following observation, quote, we encountered the risk and the labor, the state risking nothing, and reaps a large share of the profits with a reversion of the whole. The great works completed rest at the bosom of New Jersey, and they will remain forever. They have a place in the history of the past, and they will have a place in the history of the future. If that future shall point to them as memorials of the broken faith and voided contracts of New Jersey, it shall record on the same page that so foul a stain upon her escutcheon was not impressed without resistance from her sons, unquote. Support for the joint companies came from the most unlikely camp, the Jacksonian Democrats. Stockton set up an office in Trenton at number 10 Snowden's Hotel, where officials of the joint stock companies dispense free railroad passes to members of the legislature. Such actions led to New Jersey to gain a sobriquet in the 19th century as being the state of Camden and Amboy. Peter Vroom, Democrat from Somerset County, supported the Delaware and Raritan Canal bill as an assemblyman. Later, when he became governor of New Jersey, he supported not only the Delaware and Raritan Canal, but the Camden and Amboy Railroad and the Morris Canal and Banking Company. However, after Andrew Jackson, also a Democrat, began to attack the Second Bank of the United States as an evil monopoly, Vroom and the other New Jersey Democrats began to attack state-granted monopolies. Stockton split with his fellow Jacksonian Democrats on the so-called bank war, because that is the rechartering of the Bank of the United States, because the joint companies depended on the financial support of Nicholas Biddle of Philadelphia, who was president of the Second Bank of the United States. The Biddle family was also heavily involved in the Morris Canal and Banking Company, which explains why the New Jersey Whigs, including Samuel Southard, opposed Jackson in the bank war. Southard never came out against the joint company's monopoly because he did some legal work for them. Also notable was the position of Stacy Potts, the editor of the pro-Jackson Trenton newspaper, The Emporium and True American. The paper supported the monopoly granted to the joint companies. An editorial dated January 14, 1832, began by noting that the canal and the railroad should have followed the model of the Erie Canal, but the state of New Jersey didn't have sufficient funds to do the job. Quote, but the question was then presented, will the state act the dog in the manger, unquote? It will not do this great work itself. That is settled. Will it then refuse to suffer others to do it, unquote? The editorial went on to say that there were three alternatives: not to build the canal, and the great system of national internal improvements will be defeated for want of this connecting link. The state must do it. That would be alternative 2. Or 3, the state should incorporate a company to do it. Quote, The legislature finally, after balancing and weighing matters of great deal, took the last. What ought they have done? The editorial went on to note that the counties of Morris and Essex had opposed building this canal. Quote, "We originally wanted the state to make these works. The counties of Morris and Essex were always opposed to this. Had it not been for these two counties, the companies would never have been incorporated. The state would have done the work. But as these improvements had to be done by companies, we were in favor of limiting the power of these companies to 30 and 50 years by securing the state the right to take over works at that period at cost. This was a great drawback upon the companies, but it was made the law. They took the risk and for use of 30 to 50 years," unquote. After Democrat President Andrew Jackson in July 1832 began his attack on the Second Bank of the United States, a monster monopoly, the Trenton Emporium, as a monster monopoly, the Trenton Emporium and True American ran a series of 10 articles on monopolies in the spring and summer of 1835, in which it attacked all monopolies as being anti-democratic. However, some monopolies it viewed as worse than others. It noted that the Morris Canal and Banking Company was granting monopoly privileges before the Delaware and Canal Charter. Quote, "The Morris Company was the first incorporated in this state, created for the purpose of forming an artificial navigation. To them was given a special charter. Their capital is $2,500,000. They have canaling and banking privileges. Nature had forbidden the construction of any railroad running parallel to their work, and the legislature excluded all canals from coming within 10 miles of it. The charter was for 99 years, and then, if taken by the state, must be taken at its actual worth at the time, not at cost. The only revenue the state was to derive from this work being 0.5% tax on the capital stock paid in, and this was not to be assessed until the 11th year of the charter," unquote. The paper regarded the monopoly granted to the Delaware and Raritan Canal as less onerous than the one granted to the Morris Canal. Quote, "The Delaware and Raritan was the second canal chartered. In its provisions, it was more moderate. The canal is 1,500,000 the capital is 1,500,000. It has protection of 5 miles. Nearer than this, no canal or railroad can approach it. Its charter runs for 55 years, at the expiration of which the state may at cost as much less as it is appraised at. The transit duty is imposed for the benefit of the state of 8 cents for every passenger and 8 cents for each ton of coal, lumber, lime, wood, ashes, and transportation thereon," unquote. The transit paid by the Camden and Amboy Railroad provided 70% of the revenue of the state of New Jersey prior to the Civil War. The paper concluded that, quote, "No more canals are called for, either by speculators or for wants of the community. We need fear, therefore, no further increase in this class of monopolies," unquote. There was an interesting postscript to this series that revealed the newspaper's soft position on the joint company's monopoly. This was found in the last article on the series dated August 8, 1835. The article makes mention of a Pennsylvania monopoly, which it sees in its league with the Bank of the United States, and the article attacks it as being a quote-unquote foreign monopoly. Quote, "The jobbers who conceived the plan were not only of the city of the Mammoth Bank, that is Philadelphia, but known to be the devoted supporters of the monster. They became incorporated by an act of a legislature which, although reputed democratic, openly advocated the bank, and they have been until recently in a great degree under the direction of a family of New York speculators who are allied in principle and feeling as well as blood to the present federal candidate for the presidency, Daniel Webster, unquote. They expected the whole Whig press so soon as they saw on which side their distinguished political leader had arrayed themselves and heard the silver tones of the Fredonian, a Whig newspaper, calling them to rescue, would join the war cry of down with New Jersey, down with Jersey interests, down with the plighted faith, and up with the foreign monopoly. How signally have they failed? Yet enough has inspired to satisfy every intelligent mind that in origin and character the monopoly is aristocratic, and that its great aim is and has been, like that of other monopolies, to aggrandize itself at the expense of the community at large, unquote. The article was referring to a challenge to the Camden and Amboy Railroad by the Philadelphia and Trenton Railroad to extend a line to connect the New Jersey Railroad that ran from Jersey City to New Brunswick. This Philadelphia-based company bought the right of way of Trenton and New Brunswick Strait Turnpike Company and petitioned the state of New Jersey to authorize the building of a railroad along this right of way. To support their challenge to the Monopoly Act, the Philadelphia Company brought in Jacksonian Attorney General of the United States Roger B. Taney, formerly the Chancellor of New York James Kent, and the Whig lawyer Daniel Webster of Massachusetts to argue that the Monopoly Act was not binding on the state. The legislature defended the bill by a majority of 3 in the Assembly. As a further defense against the Pennsylvania Company, the Camden and Amboy bought a controlling interest in the Trenton Delaware Bridge Company to prevent the Pennsylvania Company from entering New Jersey through Trenton. The New Jersey controversy became a trial run for the U.S. Supreme Court case of the Charles River Bridge v. Warren Bridge of 1837, in which Robert B. Taney, now Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, wrote the majority opinion that the absence of any specific language granting, quote, exclusive privileges, unquote, in state-chartered corporations, none can be inferred. That is, that the state-granted charter did not necessarily convey a monopoly to the company. This was the same Chief Justice Taney who gave the majority decision in the more famous Dred Scott decision of 1857. It is noteworthy that Daniel Webster argued the Charles River Bridge case on the side of upholding the original grant of ferry rights to Harvard College, which had conveyed its grant to the Charles River Bridge Company. The case is cited as setting the nation on the course of limiting implied monopoly rights in corporate charters, and therefore allowing more competition in internal improvements necessary for the market revolution. One should note, however, that the monopoly granted to the Camden and Amboy Railroad to travel between New York and Philadelphia was not explicit, it was implicit, so the Charles River Bridge case did not apply to it. In 1867, the joint companies merged with the New Jersey Railroad, thus creating a single railroad connection between Camden and Jersey City. The Camden and Amboy monopoly ended in 1869. In the same year, the legislature abolished the transit duties and replaced it with a property tax. In 1871, the newly created United Companies leased their joint properties to the Pennsylvania Railroad for 999 years. So in the end, the Pennsylvania monopoly won out. Now, in 1838, Captain Stockton returned to active duty. In 1841, he was assigned to the Philadelphia Naval Yard, where he worked on developing a steam-powered, propeller-driven warship instead of the more common side-wheeler steamboats. She was appropriately named the Princeton, and was equipped with two 12-inch cannons that he named the Peacemaker and the Oregon, a loaded term given that the fact that the annexation of Oregon was politically controversial at that time. However, this proved to be a disaster. Stockton brought her down to Washington, D.C. for a shakedown cruise on the Potomac River on February 28, 1844. He invited the Whig President John Tyler and his cabinet and members of Congress. During the demonstration of the ship's firepower, one of the peacemakers exploded, killing the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Navy, and several members of the crew. Nevertheless, a court of inquiry exonerated Stockton of any blame. In 1845, Democratic President James K. Polk chose Stockton to sail to Galveston, Texas, with the official resolution that the Lone Star Republic of Texas was to be annexed by the United States, which led to a war against Mexico. Many Whigs, including Daniel Webster and Henry Clay, opposed the Texas annexation because it would most likely come into the Union as a slave state. With the outbreak of the Mexican War in 1846, also opposed by the Whig leaders Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, Stockton was put in command of the Pacific Fleet. He led the Navy assault on Los Angeles, while General Stephen F. Kearny's army attacked the land. Then Stockton briefly became the military governor of the new territory of California. Kearny brought with him an order appointing him the governor of the territory, but Stockton previously had appointed General John C. Fremont as civil governor of California. When Fremont refused to recognize Kearny's appointment, Fremont was arrested for mutiny and court-martialed. Stockton was relieved of his command by order of the Secretary of Navy. He returned east, where he was received in New Jersey as a hero. In 1850, Stockton resigned his commission in the Navy and resumed private life. He resumed also the presidency of the Delaware and Raritan Canal, which he retained until his death. During the 1850s, Stockton also became active in a nativistic third party known as the American Party, also known as the Know-Nothings, because of their reluctance of the members to talk about their party. They were in favor of restricting immigration and making the naturalization laws more stringent. In 1856, Stockton was considered for the presidency of the United States on the American Party ticket, but the party gave its nomination instead to former Whig President Millard Fillmore, because Fillmore had supported the Fugitive Slave Act and was more acceptable to the southern wing of the American Party. Commodore Robert Field Stockton died in his home, Morven, in Princeton, on October 7, 1866, at the age of 72. The political and business life of Robert F. Stockton, and what I have called monopoly politics, provides an insight into the workings of what historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. calls Jacksonian democracy at the state level. Schlesinger saw a direct link between the Federalists and the Whigs on the one hand versus the Jeffersonian Republicans and the Jacksonian Democrats on the other. In his view, the former were pro-business, read conservative, and the latter were pro-farmer workers, read liberal. That formula has been disproven by my former professor of mine at the University of Pennsylvania, named Lee Benson, who argued that one needs to look at the state politics to understand what was really going on. In New York State, Benson found that the Jacksonian Democrats like Martin Van Buren may have opposed the Bank of the United States as a federally granted monopoly, but supported state-chartered banks. In Benson's view, negative reference groups are also important. For example, in upstate New York, there was a strong anti-Freemason movement that opposed Jackson because he was a member of the secret society of Freemasons. New Jersey didn't have a strong anti-Masonic movement, but it did have a religious schism between the Orthodox Quakers and the Hicksite Quakers. As historian Michael Berkner has noted, while the Quakers generally formally would have opposed Jackson because of his military reputation and military record and reputation as an Indian fighter, the fact that Whig lawyer and politician Theodore Frelinghuysen argued a legal case in favor of the Orthodox Quakers made the majority Hicksite Quakers pro-Jackson. According to Benson, ethno-religious factors were also more important than class. Princeton University historian Sean Wilentz says that the leaders of both the Whig and Democratic parties came from the same elite social stratum. Both tried to court the emerging workers' political movement, which led to an unsuccessful attempt in New York City, and I should add in New Jersey, to create a third working man's party, that is, the Workies. The Whigs courted them on the grounds of the protectionist pro-tariff issue, and the Democrats on the grounds of the anti-monopoly rhetoric. In fact, one wing of the Democratic Party, known as the Locofocos, a reference to the matches used by this faction at meetings of Tammany Hall in New York City when the lights were turned off to prevent radicals from being heard, were emphatically anti-monopoly in all forms. Wilentz's argument helps explain New Jersey. Samuel Southard, one of the leaders of the Whigs in New Jersey, as Michael Berkner has shown, started out as a Jeffersonian republic and for a variety of reasons became a Whig. Peter D. Vroon, the Jacksonian Democrat governor of New Jersey, also began his career as a Federalist. So it should come as no shock that Robert F. Stockton, like his father before him, began his political life as a Federalist. Both father and son supported John Quincy Adams in the election of 1824. But when at Southard's urging, Adams appointed someone other than Richard Stockton to a patronage judgeship, both father and son changed their support to the emerging anti-Adams Democratic Party. Stockton and Southard represented rival canal interests. Stockton was president of the Delaware and Raritan Canal Company, and Southard was the investor and later president of the Morris Canal and Banking Company. But this alone doesn't explain the difference between the Whigs and Democrats in New Jersey. Clearly, there were shifting political alliances. Jacksonian Democrats, like Governor Peter D. Vroom, began to take an anti-monopoly stance in regard to the joint companies in wake of Jackson's attack on the Second Bank of the United States. Stockton began to take an interest in the Whig Party. In the election of 1840, Stockton campaigned for the Whig candidate for President William Henry Harrison and his successor, John Tyler. But when the Whig governor of New Jersey, William Pennington, overturned the Camden and Amboy transit duty, condition of the transit duty only applying to passengers traveling between states, Stockton and his associates resumed their alliance with the Democratic Party. Stockton's situation was not unlike that of John C. Calhoun. While nominally a Democrat, he split with Jackson on several issues, some personal, like the Peggy Eaton affair, some in political ambition, Jackson's choice of Martin Van Buren of New York as his designated successor rather than Calhoun, and some sectional, that is, Jackson's opposition to South Carolina's nullification of the tariff of 1832. Yet while Calhoun formed alliances with the Whigs, he returned to being a Democrat. Stockton's ease at moving from Federalist to Democrat to Whig to Democrat to Know-Nothing reflects something important about the broad political-based parties not just in the second party system, but perhaps also today. As historian Edward Pessin has noted in his essay, Society and Politics in the Jacksonian Era, two political parties were not synonymous organizations dedicated to a uniform set of political principles. Each of the parties differed from one another, more often than not containing discordant or conflicting elements that were unified only by their common lust for office and favors that went with it. The stock in trade of the state parties was legislature conferring bank, canal, and railroad charters on members of corporate groups who belonged or were sympathetic to the party in power, enacting reforms likely to strengthen the hold and the party, thus trying to convince the electorate that the issues of the parties chose to contest in the legislature and at the polls were real issues facing the American people. It also shows something about the relationship between third parties and the two major parties. As long as the issue of slavery, after which Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase became a question of extension of slavery to the Western territories, was kept on the back burner, the sectional coalition on which the second party system was based could hold together. However, once the issue came to the fore, that is, the issue of slavery, the Democratic and Whig parties split over sectional lines, and for the first time only in American history, a third party, namely Lincoln's Republican Party, was able to become a major party in the third party system of the Republicans and Democrats, which we know today. I'd like to conclude with a brief comment about why we need to teach students about the second political party system in America in terms of national and state history. There is a tendency today to teach civics through current events. However, I would argue that the only way to gain a more complex understanding of the two-party system is to look at its development historically. Here we see a more complicated story of the interplay between national, sectional, and state and local issues, changing political affiliations, negative reference groups, the role of ethnicity and religion, personal ambition, political rhetoric versus partisan reality, and the role of third parties in shaping the platform of major parties. In sum, the full complexity of the American political system as it developed over time. Only this way can we understand the genius of the American system as envisioned by James Madison in his brilliant essay in the Federalist Papers number 10, in which he noted that the stability of American democracy is based on the balance between factions in a large republic. We owe it to our students to provide them with this more sophisticated understanding of American democracy.